Connor Boyack is the founder and president of the Libertas Institute, a libertarian think tank in Utah. In that capacity, he has spearheaded important policy reforms dealing with property rights, civil liberties, transparency, surveillance, and economic freedom. And among his several books, some of the latest ones, he has actually built upon some classics that many Americans have already read, including Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And he has actually put out copies of this for children, well illustrated, well written, and this is something that is really inspiring for somebody like Elizabeth and me, because there's 3 generations at least in this room. And one of the things that has always been disturbing for me is I came so late to the table in understanding the concept of liberty. And it's always encouraging when you hear so many bright young people coming up generations behind us that are really well accomplished, very articulate in their presentations, and make the case for liberty better than I'd ever heard it before. And our next speaker is one of those people. So with that, I think I'd just like to point out that Connor's going to speak to a book that he has just written, and I don't think we've heard the last of him on this from him on this topic. I think that he is going to be expanding on this theme over time. I'm making that prediction. I don't know whether he'll agree with me, but the title of his most recent book, Feardom: How Politicians Exploit Your Emotions and What You Can Do to Stop Them, I think is a very important read. We got a copy of that, advanced copy, just before we flew over to Singapore. I had it read by the time we landed. Anyway, now I'd like Connor to land right here, and I'll get out of the way.
Thank you to Alan and Elizabeth for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm very honored. And Alan is right. Either he's been reading my Facebook page or his prediction is sound. I'm actually writing the sequel to the book right now. So a little bit about me first, and then we'll get into the issue. So I run Libertas Institute. We're an organization in Utah. I've been involved in politics for a while. My baby face makes me look younger than I am, so I'm older than it might appear. I always tell people I'm going to be a good-looking 60-year-old. I'm going to look like I'm 35, so it's really great. I have a question, actually. So Alan said we had multiple generations here. I want to know how old the youngest person is and how old the oldest person is. So let's start with the youngest, and it's probably in the back row. How old are you, buddy? 6. My son is 6. That's a really good age. So we go from 6 years old until, does anyone want to volunteer? I don't know. 6 to something else. Tonight's topic is one that the more seasoned among us, let's say, are going to very much recognize the patterns of what I'll be talking about. And even if it hasn't come to the forefront of your mind, you're quickly going to be nodding your head, I think, and see that, yes, that is how society is run. Yes, that is what politicians do. And then for those of you who are younger, perhaps you aren't recognizing yet some of these patterns, because recognizing patterns takes a while so that you can see them happening again and again. But it is going to be enlightening, and you're going to take some notes, and you're going to have some reading to do after. I think you're going to find this interesting. So the book is Feardom, and yeah, we've got a copy for each of you when you leave, so don't leave here without the book in the back. That's what it looks like. It's called Feardom, and I wrote this book almost because I was compelled to. I didn't want to write this book. I wanted somebody else to have already written this book. I, over the course of a few years, came to the realization that fear-mongering was widespread. And if you don't know what fear-mongering is, that basically means exploiting your emotions, making you feel scared so that I can have, or the politician or media or whoever, can have power over you. They're whipping up these fears, and they're making them bigger than they are. And maybe you're not old enough, some of you, to realize how widespread this is. But if you become attuned to it, you're going to recognize. It's like when I bought a car last year, I had never seen the car before. But now that I bought that car, I see that car like every day on the road, right? You begin to pay attention to the things that you're familiar with. And today, my hope is that you can become familiar enough with these things so that you recognize those patterns and you see them playing out. But more importantly, so that you can be able to avoid them and not be susceptible. So let's get into it. I want to start by going back to the earliest days of the American Revolution. Right after the founding of America, there was a package of bills passed by Congress and signed into law called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, we've got some nodding, but if you're not nodding, write this down, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And some of you are nodding just so you don't have to write it down. Alien and Sedition Acts. This was a package of bills that was passed by Congress and signed into law by President John Adams in response to a very real fear. Now, what was that fear? The fear was that the French Revolution was happening at the time. And if you know anything about the French Revolution, it caused a huge split here in America. The Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans, that was the political party, one of the political parties back in the day, they very much were in favor of the French Revolution. They thought that, well, look, America just went through this wonderful revolution, and look how we turned out, and now France is doing the same thing. And that was the gist of how the Jeffersonians felt about the French Revolution. The other prevailing political party was called the Federalist Party, the Federalists. And they did not like the French Revolution at all. They actually were very worried about the French Revolution. They were worried about a bunch of immigrants coming from France to America. They were worried that those involved in the French Revolution were anarchists, that they wanted no government, that they wanted just chaos and plunder and riots and everything else, that they did not understand the moral underpinnings of a safe and prosperous society. And so the Federalist concern was that all of that's happening in France, and now everyone from France is coming here to America, and we got to stop that because we don't want our new American experiment to fall flat on its face in the first years of its existence. So you had this dichotomy, you had these two warring factions when the French Revolution is happening half a world away. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by Congress. Congress was controlled by the Federalist Party. Now, if you remember from my description I just mentioned, they were the ones that didn't want the French coming. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were a package of bills, and several of the bills had to do with immigration. They increased the number of years that were required. They said that the president can deport aliens, which is a fancy word for an immigrant, someone who's not a citizen here in America. And so they empowered the government to be able to reject these French immigrants because they didn't want them to come. Again, this fear that the spillover would affect America and undermine this new American experiment. The worst bill, I think, the Sedition Act, criminalized free speech. It made it a crime for you or any American citizen to say anything that was bad about the President of the United States or the Congress. You'll note I did not include in that list the Vice President of the United States, who was Thomas Jefferson, who was not a Federalist, because back in the day you could have President and Vice President from different parties, given the way that the elections worked. And so Thomas Jefferson was left totally exposed to criticism, while the President and the Congress were legally protected. So what happened? Well, because these bills were passed to try and ward off the fears that the Federalists had, it actually ended up being turned into a political weapon. There were, and I have the number here so I don't get it wrong, 25 Republicans arrested. Now, this isn't the current Republicans. These were the Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans back in the day. 25 of them were arrested. Most of them were newspaper editors. These were people who had their own newspapers in early America, who were writing editorials in their little pamphlets and newspapers saying, this is horrible, this is crazy, this is totally at odds with everything that the Declaration of Independence was about. Now you're criminalizing speech. This president is out of control. What is he thinking? And so these guys end up getting arrested, and they're all Jeffersonians. One of them was Benjamin Franklin's grandson, by the way. There was one individual named Matthew Lyon. He was a Republican congressman from Vermont. He was the first person to be put on trial under this Sedition Act. He had written a letter published in the paper for which he was editor, and he had criticized President John Adams, his, quote, continued grasp for power. A federal grand jury indicted him for intentionally stirring up hatred against the president. Have you ever said a not nice thing about Barack Obama? I mean, I have, right? Yeah. So he was later sentenced by a judge who was a member of the Federalist Party to 4 months in jail and a $1,000 fine, having been convicted by a jury that was assembled from towns throughout Vermont that were Federalist strongholds for expressing seditious words with, quote, bad intent. Now, why do I share that story with you? I share that story because it's an example of how from the earliest days of the American experiment, this land of liberty and land of the free, fear has saturated our political discourse. It has saturated our political institutions, and it has been the basis for laws that have been passed back then and now. And there were real reasons to fear. Fear is not something that we need to completely suppress. There are different types of fear, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But you observe many types of fear here in this example, the Alien Sedition Acts. You had the Federalists who feared French immigrants and the spillover of the Revolution. You had the Republicans, the Jeffersonians. What did they fear? They feared the centralization of government. If you've read anything by Thomas Jefferson, you know that was one of his prevailing things, was decentralizing power and tearing it down. And they were seeing, oh my gosh, it's been like a decade since we had the Constitutional Convention or the ratification conventions, and now Congress is already doing this. How could it degrade so quickly? And that was what the Republicans thought. They feared that this new experiment was just going to fall flat on its face. John Adams feared. He feared for his life. There was so much criticism against him. He had a fear of his physical safety. What's interesting is that this very same individual, President John Adams, who presided over one of the first huge manifestations of fear in government, once said later in his life that fear is the foundation of most governments. Now, I want you to think about that quote for a minute. And what do you think that means? Fear is the foundation of most governments. What I think that means is that if you think of even the proper role of government from a very limited perspective, like we all maybe here in this room believe in limited government. Well, what is that? Protection of, life, liberty, and property, right? Protect our persons, protect our property, and that's all government should do. It should keep us from harming one another, but otherwise it should stay out of our lives and leave us alone to pursue our happiness. Even under that limited function, government is organized under fear, the fear of potential attack by somebody else. We fear that out there's a criminal down the street, a terrorist halfway around the world. We fear the potential of an attack, and therefore we organize together, we delegate our power of self-defense to this third party, this government, and we ask for it to protect all of us. Government is predicated on fear. John Adams was right. And yet he himself was a very astute example, I think, of how this happens, how fear undermines our political institutions. Edmund Burke, he was an Irish statesman. And he once said that no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. In the book, we get into the science behind that a little bit. It's actually really interesting how our brains work, how emotions work in our brains. And I want to share just one, 6 words, not even a full quote, that gets to what the science says. And that is that there is a power of emotion to overwhelm rationality. There is a physical ability in the brain, the way our circuits are wired, the way information travels, and the neural connections in our brain, that our emotions can literally hijack our brains. Now, for those who are teenagers or those who are parents of teenagers, you can perhaps understand that this is not too far-fetched, but the science is actually really interesting. And if you think about what that is saying, and what it goes into detail in the book, is that, well, what does it mean to be rational? Rational is if Alan were to come back up here and start swinging his fist close to my face, it would be very rational for me to duck, right? But if Alan walks in the door and then I start to go like this, that's kind of weird, right? You'd look at me like, who is this guy? I never want to hear from him again. There's rational behavior and then there's irrational behavior, okay? You have rational behavior every day. But the power of emotion to overwhelm your rational behavior means that those who want to gain power over you only need to figure out how to exploit your emotions. Because if they can exploit your emotions, they can control you. They can lead you to do things yourself or support things like policies because you feel a way that overpowers that rational part of your brain. So I want to talk about rational fears, and I want to talk about irrational fears. Rational fears, as I said, is if Alan came up and started swinging his fist, I might block him, I might do some jujitsu and fight him back, I might run away because I haven't exercised in like 4 years, so he'd probably beat me. But those are rational fears, right? Someone points a gun at you and you respond. There's a spider next to you on the floor and you jump up on a chair. There are rational fears, okay? There are things to be afraid of. Fear is not horrible, it's not something we should suppress. It's okay to be afraid. But we should have rational fears, right? We should have a reason to be afraid of something. So what are irrational fears? I want to share an example. Does anyone remember the swine flu from about 6 years ago? 2009, okay, the swine flu. In fact, kind of a funny story. If I had the projector all hooked up, I might have shown this had I remembered, but there was this funny picture that went all around Facebook and Twitter. And it was of this little, this little like 3-year-old or something, little blonde curly hair, and he's leaning down to a chain link fence, and a pig is putting its snout through the fence chain link, and the boy is kissing the snout of the pig. And everyone's joke with this image that was circulating all over the internet during the time of the swine flu was, we've identified the source, right? Here it is, the original infection from pigs to humans. That was actually my little brother on a family vacation like 15 years before. That I don't know how it made its way onto the internet and around the world, but anyways, it was kind of funny. Okay, so why do I say the swine flu? In 2009, the swine flu infected 152 people. Okay? There were 26 fatalities, all of them originating in Mexico. And yet, what was the response here? Maybe you don't remember, so I'll kind of refresh your memory. Schools were closed, which, hey, isn't such a bad thing after all. Travel was restricted. Emergency rooms were totally flooded. Hundreds of thousands of pigs were killed, if you remember that. Pig factories just slaughtered all their pigs. Hand sanitizer, I remember this. I was trying to find some hand sanitizer for a project. It was gone. You couldn't find any. Walmart, nowhere. Hand sanitizer, face masks were gone. Network news stories. Swine flu consumed 43% of their airtime. You turn on the news, you had a 50-50 chance, basically, of seeing a story about swine flu. I'll get back to that in a minute. So remember, 152 people infected, 26 deaths, all of them from Mexico, and yet that and much more was the reaction here in America. But that wasn't our first experiment with swine flu. In 1976, there was an outbreak of swine flu. Congress voted to mandatorily vaccinate the entire country. Okay? 25 people died from the vaccination. Only 1 from the virus. 25% of the American population was vaccinated before they called it off. So you have reaction, and then what do you have? Overreaction, right? Irrational response. Now, this is information from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, if I'm remembering that acronym right. The seasonal flu, the normal flu that you and I catch every once in a while, infects 28 to 56 million Americans every single year. On average, so that's how many people are infected, right? How many people die? 150 people die every single day during the 8 months of flu season, every single year. 150 people die every single day. And yet you don't see it on the news. You don't see store shelves being emptied. You don't see people freaking out. You don't see Congress voting on things. It's kind of part of our daily life, right? It's the rough and tumble of life. You get the flu, you move on. Your statistical chance of dying from the flu is very low, and yet it happens to many people every single day, but we don't see the freak out. And yet swine flu happens, and 26 people die over the course of the span of the entire, several months that it was, all of them originating from Mexico, except 1, I believe. And you see a totally different reaction. And why is that? So irrational fears. Another one was Y2K. Oh, yeah. We all remember, right? And I could go on. I mean, the book shares more examples. I'm only going to present a couple, but you get the idea of what an irrational response is, right? You have the Mayan calendar in 2012, or Y2K, right? People emptying their bank accounts. The media was talking that there would be downed airplanes, nuclear reactor meltdowns. Bank accounts would be automatically emptied because they hadn't been programmed the right way to account for 2001, right? They would stop at 2000. Communications networks would go down. Power lines would go down. 911 dispatches, you wouldn't be able to call in to 911 because that wouldn't be working. Grocery store shelves would be empty. These were all things that the media was saying. They'd have their talking heads come on and, oh, we're worried about this and we should all be afraid, right? And did any of that happen? No. Irrational fear. So you get the idea of what irrational fear is. Rational fears are okay. Irrational fears not okay. So because emotions, again, can overpower our rational minds, because you can think, well, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, why would people act that way? And if we sat down and talked about it, it would be rational to conclude that, things will be okay, and these fears are probably way overblown. And yet these emotions, we get hyped up, we watch the media, and then all of our peers are concerned. So then we subconsciously think, well, if they're worried, then I should have a reason to be worried too, so I'm going to be worried, right? All of that overpowers our rational minds. And because it overpowers our rational minds, again, those who want to get power over us can exploit that. They can manufacture that. They know what they're doing. And this isn't some conspiracy talk. There are legitimate, documented, studied cases of this exact stuff happening. This is not kooky talk. This is like fact. This is history. I want to share a story by H.L. Mencken. He's a quote, not a story. H.L. Mencken said, the whole aim of practical politics. So you're here for these few days learning about politics, right? You go to the Capitol and you see how things work and this branch of government and the other branch of government. This is being boiled down by H.L. Mencken to this. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace, it's you and I, alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep us afraid by scaring us with things that are in fact not reasonable. America in 2015. And I gave this presentation last year, and it likewise predicted America in 2014, and it will likewise predict America in 2016, unless we shape up a few things. So what is that pamphlet? It's one that probably you're at least somewhat familiar with. The Law by Frederick Bastiat. I believe you got a copy of the one produced by FEE. This is the one that our organization produces. I want to talk a little bit about who this guy was. So who here, don't be embarrassed if you haven't, who here hasn't yet heard of Frederick Bastiat or not familiar with him? All right, great. My family wants to FaceTime with me. Probably not a good time to do that. Kids want to say hello before bedtime. All right. Should we do it? Yeah. I already hung up. If they call back, we'll do it. Okay, so I call this guy the Thomas Jefferson of France. He lived in France shortly after the Founding Fathers, and he was very Jeffersonian in the way that he wrote and in the way that he believed and what he advocated for. But he came a little bit after the Founding Fathers. He was in France. He was an economist. He was a politician, a legislator, very smart guy, and he wrote a lot of books. The Law is one of them. He's written many other books, many other essays. The Law is a transformative book, and as you'll see, we'll share a few quotes as we get into it. Some of you have read The Law, perhaps already. Many of the adults here perhaps already have. So some of these quotes might sound familiar to you, but we're just going to step through a lot of what is contained in this essay. The danger to doing so is that you do injustice to the book overall, because the beauty of what Frederick Bastiat does is he starts with a fundamental question, and he says, what is law? And he starts at the very foundation of that question and then builds and then builds and then builds and then builds, so that you progressively understand things layer by layer. He explains it very simply. He's a witty guy. It's just an enjoyable read. Much like FEE does, we print these by the tens of thousands, and they just go wild, and people share them as gifts and love to read them. It is a transformative book. I know I think I can think of 2 people I've ever encountered out of the thousands I know who have read this book who have not been impacted significantly by reading it. Who here has read the book? Okay, nodding heads. I mean, do you kind of have the same effect? It gets you thinking. It makes you really consider things. So let's talk a little bit about what is contained in the Law. We're going to talk about a few of the key points, and then we'll dive into some of the quotes. The first one, of course, is that there's this idea that Frederick Bastiat has that you and I have the natural right to self-defense. Okay, so I used the example from last night of Alan coming and attacking me, right? If Alan comes in and he wants to attack me, I can defend myself. Therefore, Bastiat says, you and I, because we have that right to self-defense, we can group together and delegate that right to self-defense to a third party, to police, to private security, to whatever, to wield on our behalf, so that we don't always have to be worrying about protecting ourselves. We can delegate that to a government and have the government be in charge of that, so we can go about our daily lives and not have to worry about, the boogeyman behind every corner. So we have this natural right to self-defense. But Frederick Bastiat talks about it even more to say, not only do we have the right to self-defense, and the government can legitimately help us defend ourselves, but that is the core and essential purpose of government, is the protection of life, liberty, and property. So it's this key that we should be defended against people who want to hurt us. Other than that, there's really not a whole lot to do. I talked about this morning, this idea that many people, and you'll see this throughout your lives, I promise you, many people conflate the society, which is the voluntary interactions of each of us one to another, with the state or with government. They think that if you and I decide to voluntarily get together and agree to do something, that it's perfectly acceptable for the government to intervene and do that thing. And we'll share a great quote by Frederick Bastiat a little bit later about that. The other idea is plunder, and you've got the Tuttle Twins books in your packets. The orange one is the children's version of this, so that the younger children can understand the key concepts in there. And so for this, our illustrator, who's amazing, I mean, if you guys haven't opened that book, you'll really like the illustrations. He's an amazing and talented guy. We, of course, with the story, we used a pirate, because when you think of plunder, you think of pirates, and so we have the scallywag with his sword and everything to introduce to kids this idea of plunder, right? And everyone knows that that's bad, and we can't have plunder. But then you flip it, much as Bastiat talks about how government often legalizes plunder. And so this idea of the pirate and the universal understanding that that is bad, suddenly you put a police badge on and a hat and legitimize it, and does it become okay? Bastiat talks a lot about that in this book. Finally, Bastiat talks about, and I met a French guy a couple months ago, and he had the correct pronunciation, and I'm, of course, butchering it. It's not Bastiat, it's like Bastier or something fancy schmancy like that. But he talks about justice. What is justice? And what happens when the government, instead of securing justice and making sure that you and I are not harming one another, and that if we do harm another, there is justice, in other words, I can be recompensed for the damage you've caused me, that the government becomes a tool not of justice, but of injustice. What's amazing, and the reason why I like this presentation when I share it with different audiences, is that he wrote this in 1850. And the challenge with this book, I mean, it's a short book, it doesn't take a long time to read, but the challenge with the book is he's writing in the context of 1850 France. So he names a few people in there that I've never heard about, and he names a few of the events that have been happening in France that I don't study French history, so I don't know about it. That's the struggle with the book, is that he's like 90% of the book is just principles and logic and something that is very relevant to us today, but there's a sprinkling of application to France in his day that isn't as relevant to us. So I kind of gloss over that, and it's fine, you can work through it. But the amazing thing is that 90% is as relevant to America in 2015 as it was to France in 1850, as you'll soon see. So let's get into it. And we're just going to kind of go through, and I kind of had some fun with this, but the purpose really is to study the quotes, and there's more application to to these quotes than the things that I've assigned to it, like hope and change from Barack Obama. So I'll read all of this in case you can't see in the back. But for those of you in the front, you'll have the added benefit of me saying what you can already read for yourself. 3 quotes here that he is quoting French politicians in his own day, socialists. So he's, in this book, to refute and to show the counterpoint to what he's talking about. He'll say, well, here's the law, but check out what these crazy French socialists are saying. And then he'll rebut what they are believing. So this is what the French socialists are saying. The legislator commands the future. It is for him to will the good of mankind. It is for him to make men what he wills them to be. I mean, it's audacious for a politician to openly admit that type of thing. Our challenge today is that there are many people who believe this way in government, but they know that they can't wear it on their sleeve. And so you kind of have to read between the lines, or like Jesus said, right, by their fruit shall you know them. You have to kind of observe because they're not as frank, perhaps, as the French ones were. Second quote from another French socialist. The function of government is to direct the physical and moral powers of the nation toward the end for which the Commonwealth has come into being. Whatever that means. The third one is considering the extent of human degradation. Degrading. We're apparently degrading, or at least 150 years ago in France they were. I am convinced that it is necessary to effect a total regeneration, and, if I may so express myself, of creating a new people. How audacious is that, right? Of course, Obama wrote a book called The Audacity of Hope, and so we have hope and change. But you get so often people who think, we call this central planning. The idea that rather than you and I planning for our own lives and assuming risk like we talked about last night and weighing all the pros and cons and saying, well, if I make that decision, then there might be this bad consequence and we go do this. You know your lives better than I do. If I sat down with one of you and said, here's where you're going to go to college and here's what you're going to study and you're going to apply for this job and you're going to go live here and you're going to get married to this guy, I mean, you wouldn't stand for it. But so often the government thinks that it can play that role in our lives, if only to a limited degree, but over and over and over again. The government begins to plan our lives for us. Or as we talked about from that quote last night from Alexis de Tocqueville, it manages the options that we have. We don't have freedom. We can choose between this narrow spectrum, but we are not free. Social justice. So Bastiat talks a lot about justice. But in our day, there's this movement, there's this line of thinking called social justice. And that is that the law isn't sufficient to just punish crime and prevent aggression and help recompense someone who's been harmed so that there is natural justice. But that the law should implement social justice. That if the society perceives that there is some injustice out there in the world that is not a natural injustice, meaning no specific harm has been done, that, you know, I should have a living wage, I should be able to make $15 an hour, it is unjust for me to only be able to earn $7.50. That is a social injustice, things like that. So here's a quote from Frederick Bastiat, talking 65 years, I guess. Now this must be said, when justice is organized by law, that is, by force, this excludes the idea of using law or force to organize any human activity whatever, whether it be labor, charity, agriculture, commerce, industry, education, art, or religion. The organizing by law of any one of these would inevitably destroy the essential organization, justice. For truly, how can we imagine force being used against the liberty of citizens without it also being used against justice, and thus acting against its proper purpose? The downside we have to tonight's presentation is that I'm pulling out nuggets that require paragraphs, if not pages of context, that you can see how Bastiat really sets this up. So if you're having a hard time chewing on this, as you read the book, you'll kind of be built up to that point where this will make a lot more sense. But let me translate for you. What he's saying is that if law is meant to implement justice, it can only do that. Because if the law or if government begins to say, well, we're going to compel a certain type of religion or welfare, right? You need to help other people, so we're going to do that. Or we need to educate the rising generation, so I'm going to tax all of you so we can pay for these kids to be educated. As soon as the law steps outside of justice, it becomes a tool of injustice. So social justice in our day is in fact injustice. Obamacare. Should we see what Bastiat said 165 years ago about Obamacare? I might be stretching with some of these, but I had some fun.
That's okay.
I'm gonna do this so I can turn. But when the law, by means of its necessary agent, force, imposes upon men a regulation of labor, a method or a subject of education, a religious faith or creed, then the law is no longer negative, and I'll talk about that. It acts positively upon people. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own wills, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiatives. When this happens, the people no longer need to discuss, to compare, to plan ahead. The law does all this for them. Intelligence becomes a useless prop for the people. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. Try to imagine a regulation of labor imposed by force that is not a violation of liberty. A transfer of wealth, so this is like redistribution of wealth, imposed by force that is not a violation of property. If you cannot reconcile these contradictions, then you must conclude that the law cannot organize labor and industry without organizing injustice. Why did I pick Obamacare? Well, because it is organizing labor, it is organizing industry, it is saying we're going to compel all of you to have health care because nobody can be sick. We're going to compel all of you to pay taxes and so that we can redistribute your wealth. What it means when it says that the law should only act negatively rather than positively is that we have negative rights. And what that means is I have the right to be left alone. Right? The only reason for government to intervene is if something has happened against me. It should be warding off those rights, rather than positive, which means kind of like proactive. It's doing something for you that otherwise wouldn't happen. It's saying, here's this healthcare plan, here's this free education at school. Right? That is positive law. Bastiat talks a lot about this and has some great other quotes that we'll get into. Last night, right, we talked about the EPA a little bit, the IRS, the Department of Justice. This quote definitely relates to them. Sometimes the law defends plunder, think of the pirate, and participates in it. Thus the beneficiaries are spared the shame, danger, and scruple which their acts would otherwise involve. So what that means is if I were to steal from you, you guys would all boot me out of here and shame me, and that would be a horrible thing, right? So the scruple which that act would otherwise involve. But the law, when it does that, masks what's really happening. No one really sees that the beneficiary, the person getting the money, is actually stealing from somebody else. All that's happening is a third-party agent, the government, is doing it. And so the beneficiaries don't see what's actually happening, and I'm spared that shame. He continues, sometimes the law places the whole apparatus of judges, police, prisons, and gendarmes. I actually should have looked that up. Anyone know what that is?
French cops.
There you go.
But
Thank you.
gendarme.
Gendarme. Okay, French police. Which is odd because they already said police, but whatever. Sometimes the law places all of these government agents at the service of the plunderers and treats the victim, when he defends himself, as a criminal. In short, there is legal plunder. Now, when you read the Tuttle Twins version of this, the way that we did that story is that there's a neighbor who really likes tomatoes, and the kid is talking with the guy who has the garden. And the guy who has the garden, his name is Fred, he says, well, you know, our neighbor over here really likes my tomatoes. What would you guys think, he's talking to the little twins, what would you guys think if she came over and stole my tomatoes? Much as if I stole from you. Well, that's injustice. We all recognize that. That's horrible. And then Fred says, well, you guys, your uncle's a police officer. What if he did it and then gave her the tomatoes? And they kind of struggle with that question a little bit, right? As do we all. Because, well, isn't that okay, maybe? If we vote that way, right? And that's what Bastiat's getting about, is that there's plunder, but when it's legalized, legal plunder is no better. Legal oppression, and this is something that I don't know how much I'll get into because I could take the whole hour, but let's read the quote and then we'll talk about it. He says, generally the law is made by one man or one class of men, and since law cannot operate without the sanction and support of a dominating force, this force must be entrusted to those who make the laws. This fact, combined with the fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the almost universal perversion of the law. What's he saying right there? We're all lazy, right? We don't want to have to work a lot. We want to invest money so that we get dividends and we can live off of the profit and retire early. We want to do the least amount of work for the maximum possible enjoyment. Every single one of us. Okay? And that's what he's talking about here. That there becomes this incentive when people, rather than working, have to only support a politician who will compel this group to pay taxes to benefit this group. This group is going to vote for that politician, right? Because they can get access to money and programs and benefits that they don't otherwise have to work for. Bastiat continues. So it's easy to understand how law, instead of checking injustice, meaning stopping that stealing, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, and their property by plunder. This is done for the benefit of the person who makes the law and in proportion to the power that he holds. My concern with politics, generally speaking, is it becomes an attempt by each warring faction to wrest control, to gain that power so that they can dominate everybody else and they can impose their views. The founders called this the tyranny of the majority, the downside of democracy. right? Is it just to say that the 51% of people should be able to rule the 49%? Now, this wouldn't be a problem if we had, right, limited government, decentralized government, where there wasn't this central power that was wreaking havoc, that was stealing our property. Each one of us in this room want to get the right people elected so that oppression, that legal plunder can stop. But when that power has been centralized, it becomes very enticing to these groups to seek that power and then to oppress others with it. Entitlement society. You understand what that means? Everyone feels entitled to something, entitled to health care, entitled to retirement, entitled to education, gimme, 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 gimme. Here's what Bastiat said about that. The law has been perverted by the influence of two entirely different causes. Stupid greed, and he's not being petty in saying stupid, he's being meaningful with that word. Stupid greed and false philanthropy. There's a great quote I'm going to share in a minute that talks about the false philanthropy. But what he's basically saying here is that these are the reasons why the law becomes so perverted, why plunder turns into legal plunder. It's because people are greedy and they have this false sense of philanthropy. What does that mean? Well, what's philanthropy? It means to give, to share, to help other people. So if that's philanthropy, what would be false philanthropy? Right? Let's use the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan as an example. The Good Samaritan, that was philanthropy. He used his own time, his own money, his own energy to help the person that he encountered on the side of the road. That's philanthropy. What would false philanthropy have been? Would have been for him to, yeah, go ahead.
Would have been like for him to go and take other people's money and then give it to someone?
Sure. Or, you know, hey you, bypasser, come over here. I'm going to compel you to help this person, right? Because I have busier things to do, better things to do with my time. So come over here and you need to help him. Or taking people's money to do the same. That's false philanthropy. You're going to encounter people who think that we need an entitlement system because there are people who are needy. And there are. There always have been. The question is, how are their demands, how are their needs satisfied? Is it through legal plunder? Is it through redistribution of wealth in an entitlement society? Or is it through actual philanthropy? And of course, Bastiat talks more about that in the book. This goes a little bit to what I said a moment ago. So elections. Bastiat says, but on the other hand, imagine that this fatal principle has been introduced. Under the pretense of organization, regulation, protection, or encouragement, the law takes property from one person and gives it to another. The law takes the wealth of all and gives it to a few, whether farmers, manufacturers, ship owners, artists, or comedians. Under these circumstances, then certainly every class will aspire to grasp the law, and logically so. Jason, who just had to leave us actually from Fee, talked this morning right before the trading game about incentives. There certainly are government-created incentives, but there are also natural incentives, right? When I am in the bathroom and I get done, and it's one of those shared bathrooms at the airport or here at the hotel, there is an incentive for me to wash my hands. Because if I go to the bathroom and I walk out of here, none of you are going to want to shake my hand, right? We have incentives to change our behavior. It doesn't always have to be rules, regulations, and the law. But what happens is when you have the government centralizing that power and in charge of so many people and so much property, as Bastiat says, every class will aspire to grasp the law.